Hello everyone and welcome to our virtual summit, Ready, Set, Go, Accelerate Your Governance with Microsoft 365. Over the next 3 days, we are going to hear from MVPs, governance experts, M365 experts who are going to tell us more about how you can really manage and govern your Microsoft 365 estate. Today, our guest will be Richard Harbridge from Canada. He is Microsoft MVP and CTO on to Lead. And he's going to talk about more about governance and governance topics in Microsoft 365. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Tony, I'm CEO of Syskit, and I'm going to be your host for the next 3 days. Syskit is a software development company. We specialize in governance tools and software, and my colleague Alexandra will be joining us on this session as well, and she's going to tell you a little bit more on how you can govern Microsoft 365 using Syskit Point, our own governance tool. We also do other stuff, including management of SharePoint farms for those of you that are still on-prem. So if you're interested in that, jump up to our webpage. You can learn more about the tools that we are offering. Okay, to start, a couple of housekeeping items. So every session will be recorded. You are going to get a recording after this session is over. So if you have to leave earlier or you were not able to attend, you can also watch this, say, offline after we finish. There is a Q&A button on the right-hand side, as you can see on your screen. And on that screen, you can post your questions, because at the end of his session, we are going to chat with Richard a little bit about some specifics about topics that he posted, so he will be open to answer any questions. So don't forget to post the questions into the Q&A box. Okay, so our guest for today is Richard. As I said already, Richard is a CTO to Lead. He is an advisor. He worked in governance space for many years, and I remember a decade ago, when I first met him at one of the Microsoft MVP summits, he was one of the earliest people into governance area, trying to help companies to better manage their SharePoint at the time, right, Richard? It was SharePoint when we met, but today our primary topic will be Microsoft 365, and we're going to try to figure out how we can really help the companies to be better in what they do with Microsoft 365. So very well welcome to Richard today. We're going to start off with a couple of questions just to warm up the stage for Richard before he delves into a presentation and his slides. So let's start with a simple question, Richard. How did you end up in this space? How did you end up in Microsoft 365 and SharePoint as a consultant, as a technology leader? What decisions did you make in your life to become a Microsoft 365 expert today?
Yeah, I think we're always learning, so it's hard to ever be like a true expert. And most of the learning that I've gotten is from customers and from peers in the industry. So there's community events, there's events like these, and one of my favorite moments in time in the very beginning, days where I was kind of an active consultant, I was working with multiple customers. I had this debate with another MVP. At the time, I wasn't. I was just a random person in the audience. With one of the other people who were at a user group, and we debated governance. It was actually the first thing I ever had a real, really interesting discussion, because I had a very technical view of governance at the time. I was from a technical background, and they had a very business-centric discussion and view of it. And Reuven and I went back and forth on this for quite a while, and I felt like I learned a ton. It was just a great experience. And from that point onwards, I was kind of hooked to learning from others, right? Community people, other people. So, reach out to people like myself, others. Like, people are super friendly, and get in a debate. Like, try and have if you have a different opinion, like, really get into it, and you'll find the perspectives that you gain from that is probably the quickest way to grow, right? But yeah, that's how I got into it.
SharePoint and Office 365 had really active community, and you could really socialize with a lot of people in that community. It was very, very specific. It still is a very specific community, and now when I hope the pandemic is over, we'll be able to meet more at the real life events and discuss governance and other topics again. Okay, so Richard, what are the typical challenges today that you encounter when working with customers, delivering projects, or just discussing? What are, like, apart from governance that you're going to discuss today, what other challenges do people have today?
Yeah, big one's strategy. So a lot of times customers have, we all have gaps in knowledge, right? So we have domain experts. It's always better with friends. But one of the big challenges I run into with customers is that the strategy elements are really poorly planned, or there's not enough detail there. So what ends up happening is we're in a really reactive mode, right? So the pandemic happens, we're reactively rolling out things like Microsoft Teams, we're robustly creating lots of teams. And then what ends up happening is we're reacting to now the sprawl and these new challenges with so many teams, instead of, again, like thinking a little bit more proactively, like how do we think of a roadmap for multiple years, and how do we start to plan out, really what should be happening is an employee experience journey, right? So, digital employee experience matters. There's collab, there's comm, there's employee management. There's lots of elements to a good employee experience today, and super important now. So why don't define like an employee experience roadmap? And it just so happens that, a sort of teaser, I guess, for what we'll talk about today, a substrate of that would be governance, a substrate of that, or a sublane of that roadmap would be adoption, et cetera. And I think when we start to think that way, the organizations that are finally able to do it, even if it's a small roadmap, like for a subset, like AI, or a subset of technological investment, they're the ones that are further ahead than those who are always reacting and responding to things. Because that's where the business wants us to be. And unfortunately for IT, if we're always fighting fires and reacting, we can never be programmatic, and we can never be proactive. And, that's the big gap that I see, is to be proactive, we need to plan, and that's the road mapping piece.
And that gets challenging, especially with the dynamic environment that we have to manage. Microsoft 365 changing every day. You wake up and there is a new PR announcement from Microsoft. There's something new coming out. There was one announcement yesterday. I'm guessing you're going to mention that. If not, we're going to discuss at the very end of the session today. So one trick question for the end of the intro Q&A. What is there one thing you would like to change in Microsoft 365, and which one would you like to change?
So I have a big wish list, and I'm lucky enough to be on research groups and boards with Microsoft, as well as an MVP. And Microsoft does listen. So I really do, appreciate the organization for listening very well to a lot of the feedback that we've had. And it's going to sound a bit boring, but I think actually the thing that I'd like to give feedback on is if I could, if there's a key stakeholder and shareholder in Microsoft that's like, ooh, they're on this webinar recording, I think my main thing is right now pricing as you go and use needs to be a bit more effective. So Power Platform has a really good example of this, where for Power Automate or other things, you can actually kind of pay as you go, and there's newer licensing paradigms for that. I think Viva needs more of that. So there's new, for those who aren't aware, there's these wonderful new capabilities for employee experience in Microsoft Viva, for topics, for insights. I really love insights, and a bunch of others. And one of the challenges with those today is it can be challenging for customers to kind of think through that operational spending, and sometimes these can be quite significant investments. And so it would be really nice if they could say, you know what, let's do Viva, insights for everyone with management and leader insights, and then as people use them, then that starts to trigger the costs. But if they don't use them and we were wrong and people don't find value in it, we essentially don't have the same kind of costs. So I think, and this is happening in the industry, but the sooner we get to a model where the pricing is more shifted in that way, I think it enables us to experiment and try things more. And I find a lot of times IT knows that there's a better solution out there, a better way to work. And one of the barriers that I think we can make, and Microsoft themselves could do a better job of, is maybe making that cost challenge a little bit easier. So, but we can talk more about like operational cost management and things like that too.
Yeah, I hear you, and I understand it can be a huge challenge for to plan that. And you were talking about planning before, to plan for pricing and packaging for very large organization. It can be a challenge to figure out, okay, what is the exact licenses and how much is this going to cost to deploy for our entire people.
And as a digital person, I know those things are extremely worth the investment, and they're actually very low priced. Like Microsoft's good about commoditized, like democracy pricing, like really low cost. But even then, it's the way in which we purchase it, I think, could be better.
Yeah. Okay, so this is the end of our intro Q&A. So Richard, the floor is yours, and let's talk about governance.
Awesome. If you can just give me, yeah, perfect. Awesome. And I'm just gonna hide my little face there. All right, you guys should be able to see my screen, and I will kick it off. Awesome. All right, well, thanks everyone for joining today. This is, for those who haven't seen me present before, I apologize in advance. My sessions are like drinking from a fire hose. There's a lot of information and we never have enough time to cover it all. So what I'd like to do is suggest two things for today. One, you'll have the recording. Two, you have the slides. They're actually in the sidebar of the GoToWebinar. And then for those who are watching the recording later, you have access to those slides as well through, social and other app opportunities and spaces. If you have questions on governance and you're like, some of the things that Richard talked about was interesting, again, just like I mentioned in the Q&A at the very beginning, it's a really good idea to reach out to people. There's speakers actually for tomorrow and Thursday. If you haven't had a chance to look at the schedule, this is like a multi-day live summit, and they're super friendly as well. I'm big fans of both of them. So if you have questions yourself and you're working through governance, it's better to do it with friends, and please reach out. The other reason I mention this is because in today's session, while I will cover a lot, I can't be as prescriptive, right? I don't know where you are in your governance journey, and I can't show you customer examples as more readily because obviously that would be more challenging in this broader format. So in a one-on-one context, especially if we get an NDA in place, we can do a lot more prescriptive guidance, and I might even be able to give you assets and resources, templates, things like that to get you started. So again, I just really would encourage you to reach out after the session or even during it. All right, so with that, let me kind of dive into the session today. Today, what I want to do is I want to talk about 5 things. Most of the discussion is probably going to be in this plan for technology governance. It's going to take a little bit of time. I want to go through 1 or 2 examples, but we will talk about each of these things. Kind of the weakest sections or the shortest ones will be governance never being done, because I think pretty much everyone on here probably already understands that intuitively. And then we'll talk about sort of this idea of proactive governance and adoption. So let's talk about efficiency. As you probably have heard many times over the years, people have used the word governance, and most of the time when I hear governance from customers, I hear it associated with risk mitigation. And it's true, right? Governance is absolutely something that supports risk mitigation, but it's actually not the core of governance, right? The purpose of really governance is about efficiency and effectiveness. So let me give you a very a specific example. Let's say you have the best talent, right? Your organization has amazing technologists and people, leaders, other people in your organization. And the best talent in the world, if they don't have, roles, structure, playbooks, if they don't have support, they don't have the right equipment, then they're not going to be effective. So if we take the example of football, whether it's, sort of children playing where there's less structure, less coordination, to something that's, like the NFL or even if we use like soccer and worldwide football, in both of those models, the best teams are effective not because of just talent, but because their talent is maximized. Their talent knows where to play, where they're going to be on the field, where other people are going to be. They know how to lean on each other. They know each other's strengths and weaknesses. They know, because they have, in football, American football is a great example. They have an offensive line, a defensive line. They have special teams. They have coaches for each of those. They have playbooks. They have execution patterns that they do, where again, they know where each other is going to be. And these things, the equipment, right, having good gear also makes a difference too, right? Just like how, having the right technology makes a difference. If you put these things together, that leads to success, right? It's not the individual excellence of a person that makes it successful. It's that the team is maximizing each other. And that's typically done through these things that surround and support the team. And that's really what governance is. I would argue that if you got the right people in a room, if you got all your ops people, all your dev people, in separate meetings, they're going to talk about ops and dev, and they're going to talk about Microsoft 365 ops, Microsoft 365 dev, and naturally they're going to produce things like policies and guidance and resources and things like that are byproducts or results of good governance. So really the trick is thinking of this more as like a team model where we're just trying to get the right teams together. And yes, absolutely accelerate their work by giving them pointers and direction on what to focus on in what order. But generally speaking, it is really much more about just having the time and investing in the ability for us to improve how we execute. And so that's the gist. Less about risks and policies for focus. Those are byproducts. Those are results where risks are mitigated. The real focus is on execution efficiency and the focus on, basically performing better with the talent we have. And this is especially true today with the Great Reshuffling or the Great Resignation or these other trends where it's very difficult to both find new talent and retain a talent. So if you're not investing in governance, this is a big wake-up call that now is the time to do this for a variety of reasons. So I hope that resonates with you. Feel free to use those analogies of sports teams, but in general, governance is much more about efficiency than risk. And as we build on that, then the question is, how do we plan for governance? So how do customers get started? Where do they kind of make mistakes? The first one that I often see is a lot of governance challenges and discussions I have with customers is they want to jump straight to automation. They want to jump straight to like proactive, roles and responsibilities being reviewed, distributed management where the organization's empowered to do things, et cetera. And I love those things. That's what you should absolutely work towards. But most of them haven't ever gone through the base configuration. They haven't explored settings that are in Microsoft 365. Each of the admin centers have a bunch of settings. They don't know what those settings are. They don't know why they're on or off. They don't know what's deviated from default, what defaults may not be the right setups for them, and much more. So what we really want to focus on for most customers is on the enablement and doing that responsibly, right? So configuring things in a better way, making sure we understand how they're configured, how they're managed, et cetera. And that's really, really important. Now you can do that with tooling that actually breaks down all those settings and walks you through it, like Syskit, or you can do it yourself directly. And so again, there's multiple ways to approach this problem. But if you don't do that enablement right, it's really difficult to do the automation stuff. As an example, we run into customers all the time who say, I want to automate this part of the process. And we say, well, okay, before we do that, where is this even enabled? So they want to make sure that they're protecting for external sharing. Well, where is external sharing enabled? Where is it not enabled? How have you configured that per service? How have you configured that at the SharePoint service level? How have you configured that for OneDrive and much more? So we really need to dig into those types of settings first and make sure that they're configured the way the organization wants before we can automate them. And so hopefully this makes sense to those who are listening. So how should we tackle that? Well, of course, there's a multitude of ways to doing this. One of the ways that we often encourage is workshopping. So working sessions, getting people, like I said, together in a room, it typically results in good outputs. And so you could literally, if you wanted to, just go through every setting. Now there's settings in the GUI, the admin center that you can go through. And then there's of course some settings that are only managed by PowerShell. I'm suggesting going through both sets. But essentially, if you just literally went through and clicked through each of the settings and said, hey, is this where we want it to be configured? Do we understand what this setting does? Those are the two quick checks. Do we essentially have organizational understanding and is it configured right? If you can check both those boxes, move on to the next one, the next one, and the next one. It's not something that has to take a lot of time, actually. A lot of the reason that this becomes more problematic is people try and solve it all at once. No. If you know that there's a setting, you're like, I think we need to do more research, we need more information, or we need more time to discuss this setting, you table that, you move on to the next one. And what you're left with is hopefully a relatively small number of configuration properties and things that have a variety of dependencies where you need to have discussions to kind of validate and prepare for. That's what we classify as responsible enablement. At the same time, even if you go through all these configuration settings, you still need to think about risk mitigation and you do need to think about responsibilities. Now I'm going to emphasize the term responsibilities here instead of roles because I think that's a little bit more important. And I'm going to zoom in because this is so hard to read. But essentially what you see here is an example of an Excel worksheet. And it really doesn't need to be fancy. I'm trying to use something really simple that a customer has used in the past. And so you can see here they have the technology, they have some phasing, they have responsibilities. The responsibilities is the magical, most important thing. And then they essentially have when is it targeted to be done and when was it last completed. They even have a sense of frequency. Again, almost all of these are not ever initial one time only. They're always at least reviewed annually in most of these settings. The reason for that is because Microsoft 365 changes, your organization changes, and we need to make sure that those things are still congruent with the settings and configurations we've done in the past. So these are things where you can essentially assign a person, let's say Richard Harbridge is the lead for this item, this responsibility. That doesn't mean that I have to do all of it. It just means that I have to track, did we complete it? Are we on track? Are we not? Those types of things. And you can really define things as must, should, could. There's some things we'd love to get to, but they're not critical right now. So really use, Moscow or whatever preference you have to determine, how you organize these backlog of responsibilities. And again, I wish I had time to go through more of these, but you get the gist. So doing those types of activities, both going through the config settings and then talking through core responsibilities, ones that aren't in config necessarily, but are broader things that need to be managed, those are really useful discussions. The third pattern that you do for technology governance is to define a bit of a roadmap or timeline. Now, I mentioned this earlier, but it's really important to think of it as like a swim lane or a substrate where governance, if I have an intranet roadmap and I have a new modern employee experience for communications that I'm deploying, and so maybe I have an intranet, I have Teams company communicator app. If you don't know what that is, it's so company comms can push like messages through Teams. If you want to have those types of Microsoft investments, you want to make sure that they're framed, right, in a way that actually still has, what are the governance considerations that enable this and empower it? How do they make that more successful? What are the adoption considerations? I would argue adoption and governance are really good sort of swim lanes underneath. Now, if you want to combine it all, that's even better. But in general, most organizations, the struggle is that they do have roadmaps, but most of these roadmaps don't consider the governance or adoption elements effectively or enough, right? They don't think of it longer term, past the cycle of the project, and then you can't aggregate it across, a program of projects that relate to Microsoft 365. Here's another way to look at it. Microsoft 365 has a lot of services. Now, this can be overwhelming, but those services each have different things we need to think about for governance. Responsible enablement, which I've talked about a lot today, provisioning, the collection, provisioning the collection, provisioning, the content. Those are two different discussions, and much more. And so this can be really overwhelming because of how many services, right? The Viva experiences add, like, arguably with Viva Goals, which is now public, which is great, as well as some other Viva experiences which I don't think are still public yet. That's going to add 6 or 7 or however many, additional services that each have their own governance considerations as well. So this is a never-ending, and we'll come back to this, a never-ending need to define governance. So how do you kind of get started? Well, the first thing I want to talk about is that everything in here is very actionable. Responsible enablement I've already talked about with config planning and responsibilities mapping. Now I want to talk about specifically a subset of provisioning and lifecycle management, which is the collection of SharePoint site, a Microsoft team, or a Yammer community. And because these are all things that every organization is kind of foundationally needs to solve, because if you solve it at a foundational level, it enables a lot more empowered and programmatic governance. So let me give you some examples. We all know that content grows over time, and this is not a problem. Sprawl can be a very positive indicator of adoption, but when it's unmanaged sprawl, that's when it's a problem. Essentially, if we know what all these spaces are, right, it's not an issue. If we don't know what all these spaces are, that's where it becomes really problematic. Let me give you some examples. Let's say you have a bunch of spaces that are called operations or management or sales, etc. A lot of times when you have a lot of these terms, they're used for many, many names of teams and spaces and things like that, and it becomes really difficult to navigate across them. This is very pronounced in organizations over 100 people, but even in an organization like ours, this is literally from our tenant, this is a very consistent problem as well. So the out-of-the-box experiences, which are great with pinning and hiding things, et cetera, for teams, they're necessary, but they're not sufficient for true scale and the considerations that most of us have. And you might say, okay, well, that's a problem at an end user level, but it must be better on the IT side. No, it's not much better on the IT side. It is true that you can go to the admin center for Teams or SharePoint, and you can look at all the different spaces we have. We can know things about them, like when was it last modified? We can get a sense of, like, is it tied to a private channel, a shared channel? Like, there's things that are very useful about these admin centers, but what it's missing is that business context. There's no way for you to know that this site relates to a department, or that this site relates to a product, or this site relates to a client, and so on and so forth. And that information is actually extremely valuable. I'll come back to it, but it's something that drives a lot of improvement. So again, why do we need to manage sprawl? We need to manage sprawl because if we don't, right, then we're only reacting to sprawl, and our reactions are very limited in what we can do at scale. This really increases cost of ownership for IT, and it's quite frankly untenable. You can't maintain your Microsoft 365 environment if you're not managing it in this way. So there's lots to talk about here. I won't talk about all of them, but I'll just use 1 or 2 quick examples. So one of the patterns that I'll come back to is, let's say you have a number of spaces that have been created. If you think about the way a lot of these spaces are created, if there's no consistency, no templating, no patterning, it's very difficult to optimize them later. So while today you might create 200 project sites, and that's great, and project teams and so on and so forth, if all of a sudden in the future you want to optimize all those project teams so that they have a new tab, and that tab is going to point to the project operations investment in Dynamics or something else that you've invested in, Project Online, et cetera. You can't do that because you'd actually have to know which 200 of those sites are actually related to projects, right? So if you don't, in the very beginning, determine how you're going to map that, then it becomes really challenging later because you can't assess that as IT. At an end user level, it's not much better, right? We get redundancy all the time where, you know, someone with the right intentions as a good steward creates a space and then realizes, oh, this space isn't necessary because we actually have another space over here that's solving that problem that's more organized, and then this becomes orphaned. So we'll talk about those kinds of challenges. If you're looking for more guidance on, you know, how to manage this, why it needs to be managed, you can take a look at this ebook, this free ebook, which is m365sprawl.com, and it breaks down all these things that I'm mentioning in great detail. So yeah, again, m365sprawl.com. All these references I will have at the end of the deck as well when we have our Q&A, so don't stress if you didn't get a chance to write down the URLs. All right, another good one here is the provisioning itself. So how do you create spaces? Did you know today there's over 20 places? I was actually trying to do a count the other day. I think we found 24 different ways that you can create a SharePoint site. There's 24 different places through the UI and UX that you can create a SharePoint site today. So the question is, what if we could make that simpler, both for end users and improve governance at the same time? And this is something I highly recommend for any organization over a certain size. The reason over a certain size matters is because in theory, if you have a small enough volume of these new sites and spaces, then a dedicated headcount or person might be able to actually manage, maintain, and understand what they are, because it's a really small conversation window, right? They can reach out to this person, they can respond, and they can get the information they need. When you start to reach any scale over 50 people or 100 people, it's next to impossible to do that. So you need something that hopefully captures key information like what department does this relate to, which product does this relate to, which client does this relate to, and so on and so forth when you go to create the space. The good news here is it's actually really easy to do this. You can redirect this form to your own form as an example. There's other ways to do this as well, where you essentially have a request process instead of a creation process. A request process, people request the type of digital space they need, give you information around it, and then you hopefully not just create one for them, but you template, tailor that for them, and improve that configuration. So how can you do this yourself if you don't know how to do this part, like to change these forms? You could just use a out-of-the-box Microsoft list, and you can have that Microsoft list be essentially for requests, and then you could have another list, which we'll talk about a little bit later, as a registry, and those are two out-of-the-box Microsoft lists. And so now you have a Power Automate on the request one, you go approval, etc., adds it to the registry, and then you have to provision either manually or through various Power Automate calls, etc., to then provision the sites. So that's a way you can do it relatively out of the box. Another way you could do it is you could kind of build your own solutions. So here's one that's actually available for you to download and try yourself, which is a request form that's built into Microsoft Teams. The idea is it's like a request to team function. And one of the things I really like about this one is it does have things like cloning your requests. So if you've done a request before, and this one's similar to the last one, like maybe another project site, you can clone it and then edit it as an example. So sort of starting from a position where you've already filled out a bunch of things, you just need to tweak some stuff. So there's really great quality of life experiences here that are arguably better than the out-of-the-box experience because, again, a bunch of metadata on the things are filled out for you. These are all customizable. If you're interested in this idea or others like it, and I'll come back to this resource, we have this big collection of 40 plus examples for improving the employee experience. You can get it at m365ideas.com. So this one is outlined there, as well as quite a few others. All right, so let's talk about this process. Let's say you do have a form, out-of-the-box list form, a third party like Syskit, or you have something like, something inspired. Please don't use this in production. Something inspired by like request a team. Excellent. Then the question becomes, what about organizations where they can't control that creation experience? And I've seen pushback on this, where organizations are like, we really want to make sure it's fast. Again, you can make it automated. That request form can automatically provision and create the space. You might make it so only approvals are needed for these types of people, but people who have created spaces before, or people who have been trained or whatever, they get auto approval. Again, there's lots of ways to make it so it's seamless and as easy as the out-of-the-box experience. But if you really can't control that, I understand role authority has limits, then what you could do is you could say, what if when we create the space, we then look at that space afterwards? And this is kind of how Microsoft has been tackling this as well. So when they create a space now, there's a new experience that lights up for the first time you create that space, and it says, hey, would you like to choose one of the existing templates to provision on top of this? Now, this isn't as robust as creating a template from scratch. Again, there's more you can do in the initial creation than you can do once it's been created. But you can, there's this idea of like, oh, let me apply, add some libraries, let's styling, look and feel, web parts, etc. after creation. So there's very much a way to do this where you use hubs, like people attach it to hubs and you apply this stuff, where you apply site templates exactly through this kind of experience from your organization. There is ways to improve things after they're created. In the same way, this is an example from one vendor, because I wanted to show a few different examples today, where essentially they have this post creation, tell me more about that space type exercise. Now, I want to be clear. You can do things like this with many vendors, and you can even do it yourself with Power Automate. Let's say on that registry list, hey, it's been created. Tell me more about it. I don't know anything about it. I just know it's been registered. I just know that it exists. I found it. That's one way to do it. I don't encourage this fundamentally because we find that the adoption is very low here. And without key metadata, like departments, you can't escalate. The beauty is if someone doesn't fill this out and we know it relates to a department through the request process, now we can escalate to a departmental lead, right? There's patterns there because we have this metadata. Without it, we're really limited. So again, I really fundamentally think while this is excellent and great ways to tune things, et cetera, and maintain things, it's much better to focus on the creation experience itself for new spaces. Another big one is, I've mentioned metadata a couple times. This metadata is very valuable because it enables not just improved experiences, like the fact that I can template a space, based on the information you give me, but it also allows us to do things like set default metadata. So if you don't know this, since like early 2009, there was this ability to set default metadata even at a folder level. So you could just kind of drag and drop a file, create something within a document library. So any way, in shape or form you can add a file, it can have department equals HR by default. So this is useful because if I say I'm creating a project site and I say it's an HR project site, it's department equals HR. Now what we can do is make sure all the content in that site automatically has department equals HR applied to it. This improves search with refiners and experience layers. It improves information protection. It improves sensitivity and retention rules as well, because we can target that. We can say, well, I want to apply a DLP policy or a label to all of the content that department equals HR or department equals finance, which might be different than the one I apply to other spaces. So very, very helpful. It's also very helpful for roll-ups. So let's say I have an intranet and I have this wonderful HR landing page, a departmental landing page. Well, if I have this default metadata, I can do things like use the out-of-the-box highlighted content sweep part and say, show me all of the recent documents. And you can say, here's all the HR recent documents across projects, across departmental sites, anything that relates to HR. Here's the most recent updated ones for you to see. And we can do that because it's just a simple filter, department equals HR. In the same way, and we'll talk about it later, we can do this with directory experiences as well. So there's lots more reasons. I could go on and on. Metadata is so critical for governance, for programmatic rules, for us to be proactive. We need it, the metadata, for us to be successful. So now the question becomes, okay, we get it. We should have a request form. We should have metadata there. We have a bunch of existing spaces. And let's be frank, sometimes people will just pick a value and it's incorrect. How the heck do we actually solve this problem of getting people to fill out the metadata process? Well, there's a few ways. Number one, you could do simple things. Like when a person creates the space, right, again, through the request process form, you could have something like add it to the registry and then notify the department lead. Just an FYI, hey, this department this person created a site within your department. It's related to your department equals HR, and it's about this stuff. Now you might say, hey, wait a second, I thought sometimes we'll create sites and they'll have private names, or we'll create, SharePoint sites or Microsoft Teams or other things that are private names. First of all, never, ever, ever, ever do that, right? Because if you share your screen or someone else shares their screen, someone's going to see that name of that confidential site or team. You should just never, ever, ever allow or enable or empower people to have confidential names in sites and teams, etc. If you remove that, all of a sudden it's fine if everyone knows that any site or team exists. And that's really important, because foundationally, if you want to have good governance and we want to be proactive, we need to all be on the same page. There has to be transparency that these sites exist and that these are the owners of them, et cetera. Now, once you check that box, now that example I just gave of FYIing, the department lead actually adds a lot of value, because that department lead might proactively, again, without IT cost of ownership, say, hey, this is a similar space to this other one. They resolve that between each other. Now they consolidate that, do whatever they want. Maybe they acknowledge it for IT, and then IT can get rid of that orphaned or that redundant space. You can even change the request form. So when you fill out the request form, because by the way, type ahead, like you type in the name of the space and you call operations, that's not really helpful. It shows you like 200 operation sites or teams that exist. But if you do things like I type in operations as whatever, my name is operations. On the right-hand side, as I'm going through the form, I fill out, okay, it's related to HR, it's related to employee files, whatever. I'm filling out a bunch of different metadata. As I'm filling out that metadata, you could actually show the registry or directory, either one, along the right-hand side. And then they could see, oh, like as they're typing in stuff, there's more and more spaces that are narrowing, there's less and less spaces that are narrowing and narrowing that actually represent what they're choosing. And that can be really helpful because it reduces redundancy. You often find when you have these kinds of experiences, they don't actually create the space. They'll go, oh, this one already exists, the contact's there, click the contact name or reach out. And we can just, capture, did they click the name, and then determine if they stopped and never moved back to that request process, it's highly likely that we actually saved time and effort there, creating a redundant space. So there's lots of like self-reporting that you can build into this as well. All right, so let's take a step further. I mentioned directories in this registry before. So what is the value of this? Well, I mentioned it's hard sometimes to get people to fill out metadata. And when you create a new site or space, people have to, metadata is only matters. How many pieces of metadata should we ask? It's only whatever number makes sense to the user. So if they see value in the metadata, they'll fill it out properly. If they don't see value, it's not gonna help. So how do we help people understand the value? Now, we've talked about default metadata, search, all these other experiences. It's hard to explain that to an end user. However, people understand directories. They're really intuitive. So you say, look, if you fill out this metadata, it will light up in a variety of places. It will show up in our directories. Again, remember the registry can just be an out-of-the-box list. So you could expose that list with views, with web parts, the show filters. These are all out-of-the-box controls, and it could look something like this, where I'm at the communities section, and here's all the communities. Some of these are Yammer, some of these are Facebook, some of these, it doesn't matter what they are. They're just abstracted, right? Representations of the community, and now people can filter and refine, and they can sort, and they can organize it how they want. And if someone goes, hey, how come my community is not listed here? It's a really easy discussion. You didn't tell us the type is community, and you didn't give us this metadata, right? That's community centric, et cetera. Similarly, if I was going to the HR departmental site, like we mentioned earlier, I scroll to the bottom of that page. Maybe at the bottom of that page, I might have something like this web part at the bottom, and it would say a department equals HR is the default filter, and now it's showing all the departmental HR teams, sites, spaces, et cetera. And this is really beneficial because now it's very clear when people go, how come I'm not showing up here, et cetera. Oh, you need to give us that metadata. Very, very helpful for organizations that maybe have a great new form experience, et cetera, for new requests, but have thousands of sites that aren't managed, that are not known today, that need this metadata. So you can say, hey, when you get a chance, fill this out because it'll show up inside of these directories, et cetera. And we can also do some proactive things to help you out, like provide adoption guidance and a bunch of other things. Think about it like this. If you have the request process, we can easily tell, did this person ever create a site before? Did they or did they not attend training? And then based on that, we can create a tailored sort of email campaign or whatever, right, that helps them through the learning process around, using and maximizing their new site. Security attestations, again, you could do things like check people for those things, and then again, to escalate, you'd have that metadata. So what we find is directory experiences are, one, a big problem. You need something like this because the out-of-the-box experiences are necessary but not sufficient, right? You really do need something that goes beyond the mega menu out of the box, that goes beyond, my bookmark sites, my pinned teams. You need something else, and this solves that problem, right? It's sort of A to Z directory with filtering and things like that. It's also extremely powerful because it's foundational for governance. Remember that enablement step I talked about? This is sort of foundational because without it, programmatic rules like security attestations or other kinds of things are really difficult to do because we can't make different rules for finance sites versus HR sites versus ones that relate to clients versus products, et cetera. This is a private confidential product with a code name. That content, at the content layer should probably have automatic labels where we're applying labels that actually say, this is sensitive, cannot be perceived outside of these AD groups, et cetera, right? Those are things that make sure that HoloLens, when Microsoft announced it, wasn't leaked beforehand because they applied these kinds of rules as well. So again, if you're looking for ideas like that, this is one of those many solutions in that idea book, m365ideas.com. This is something that we've built as a custom example. That doesn't mean you have to do custom. It doesn't mean you have to do out of the box with lists. You can also buy a great solution. There'll be a demo at the end of this session on some of these things. So Syskit, who's graciously hosting this live event summit, they also have the ability to do provisioning. I really like some of these things because they have like sort of approval stages with self-service and things like that. So you're not losing anything, right, by using these. Things like the request management, how's that tracked and managed, right? How they manage that for you for reference. And then even things like, hey, there's access reviews and other things we need to do. How do we, from just an IT enablement perspective, what are the data gaps that we don't have out of the box with the admin centers and things like that? We can have better tools there, and then we can potentially do things like schedule access reviews, lifecycle management with service owners, and much more. So these are all many examples of the things that I've already been mentioning where you can use third-party tools to do that. Now that was just a small slice of governance. Again, there's a lot more to talk about if we had time. Let me zoom back up and talk about what do organizations typically do. What they'll do is they'll do responsible enablement across all the services that they're actively using. So they'll do that. Then they'll do things like the collection provisioning, the collection lifecycle. Why? Because as I mentioned, it's foundational and it's also quite easy compared to other things. Then we'll do security, and they'll typically do adoption and excellence, right? So digital excellence and adoption, they'll tackle that as well. So these are things that might be in phase one. A great example of this would be a collection concept in Power Apps and Power Automate, et cetera, is an environment. So you have to have an environment strategy for the Power Platform space, arguably for all the Power Platform space, including virtual agents, et cetera, because that environment is what enables you to be successful longer term. It allows for governance and all these other things to take place. If you have one environment, you're doing it wrong, right, for Power Platform, and you're exposing a lot of risk. So there's definitely things that should be prioritized. Then there's sort of a phase two and phase three and so on and so forth as you go. And if you're rolling out something like Teams, maybe you have to do some of these, right? Like there's some prerequisites. And maybe you really like Syskit or other tools, so you implement those. And when you do that, they're going to bring forward or maximize and improve governance around, what they touch. So there's lots of ways to tackle this, but you absolutely do need to tackle it. And this is why that proactive makes sense, because the more reactive we are, we're just lighting up different random items, and they're not really maximizing that true ROI, right, of that team, right? We're not really improving the efficiencies we want. Now, all of that was just planning for the technology side. I'm going to actually speed up. I feel like, oh, this is too slow. I'm going to speed up to talk a little bit more about what the business side does. So I can't go through all of it today, but let me give you a few key reference points. The first one, while I talked about responsibilities are far more important than roles, I don't really care if there's roles not assigned. What matters most to me is that the responsibilities are mapped to people. And yes, some of those responsibilities are service managers, or there are other types of, they're champions, they're executive sponsors, et cetera, and they should be tied to roles. That makes natural sense. It's an easier way to think about this, right? A set of responsibilities maps to a role. But again, the responsibilities are far more important than the role. That said, the business does need to participate, and the business needs to satisfy certain roles. So how do they satisfy those? And one of the things that I find really valuable is having a really honest discussion with the business about how are we performing in the roles that they're representing. So if they're champions, executive sponsors, department leads, et cetera, are they consistent across those department leads, across those sponsors in how they communicate about Microsoft 365 or our digital experience, et cetera? Are they consistent? So is communication really good? Are they coordinated in that way? Are they engaging in those tools? Are they showing people that they love these tools and they know how to use them? Are there resources that they've created or that are an output from the responsibilities that they manage that are being created as well, right? So you can track them on multiple categories. Don't just say, do we have people labeled within this category and, done, our governance document's up to date, and we just need to manage that as people change, that's maintained. That's not what you want to do. You want to really track where can we improve and where should we improve. And it's typically within something like these 4 categories. If you're looking for guidance, again, I'll come back to it, but there's a resource there for you. Another key one is what are the outputs of good governance? So you could take something like a champion program, and most organizations that have champion programs, when we inspect them, we find out that they're not annualized. So there's no like, you're a 2022 champion, and then next year happens, you're also a champion forever. No, we don't want that. We want the ability to intelligently roll out people or rotate them out if they're no longer active as champions. We want the ability to acknowledge people as champions and give them support, give them benefits that they don't get otherwise. And one of my favorite ones, the thing I'm most picky about, is when I see champion programs who actually have good champion programs. They have sponsors, they have structure, they have programs, they have guides, they have all these selection plans and everything else. The thing that I run into is they even have regional coverage. I say, hey, how many of these are non-IT, non-managers? And it's really rare that we see a lot of non-managers on non-IT. In fact, most of the time we see 0 non-manager, non-IT. And here's the thing, people learn from non-manager, non-IT. That's how they learn. Like overwhelmingly, those are the people they learn from, non-manager, non-IT. So your champion program has to absolutely influence and support and embrace those types of constituents, otherwise it will never be successful. So, so anyways, there's lots more to discuss here. You can map those types of governance deliverables, right? Like, do I have a document that looks like this or that? And you can actually track if we have that or not. And if we don't, then what's the prerequisites? What are the discussions we haven't had that led to that? Again, just getting in a room and having those discussions is really what's necessary. The document or the output will just come naturally from that. So if you're looking for more guidance here at m365resources.com or office365resources.com, you can download a questionnaire that actually has a lot of these questions for you pre-built. Don't worry, the links will be at the end. All right, another thing on the right-hand side that's really tricky is service model definition and cultural and org alignment. So I thought I'd pick the hardest of those two, cultural and org alignment, to talk about for a brief second. Essentially, a good example of tracking against if your culture is aligned is something simple like this. In your performance evaluations, hopefully they're not annualized, they're quarterly. In your performance evaluations, do you ask people not just the impact they've had on the business, customers, whatever, but impact others have had on them and the impact they're having on others? This is really important. If you have these kinds of questions worded in all sorts of different ways, if those questions are in there and at the top of the importance, criteria for self-reflection and for manager feedback, then generally speaking, you're an organization that supports collaboration, your cultural, normalized collaboration as a culture. If you don't have it, then you're not really prioritizing culture because performance is not aligned with the cultural norm of collaboration, right? And this, another key example here is if you're a manager, the behavior science is really clear on this in manager science. The truth is, the best questions you can ask is these two questions, because if you think about it, you already know typically what performance impact your individual is having. What you don't know is how other people across your team or other teams are influencing them or how they're helping others. So it's actually both beneficial from a sort of common sense, it's the right thing to do, and then two, it should be done. But you'd be surprised how many organizations we inspect with this really simple, A/B test, and we find out that many of them haven't prioritized collaboration, even though they've had multiple years of pushing, Microsoft Teams and these collaborative norms, et cetera. All right, so that's the sort of right-hand side and the business side. Again, if we had more time, we'd go through more examples. Governance is never done is a pretty straightforward concept. I've already mentioned earlier things like Microsoft Viva. Those are new workloads, and each of them have new governance considerations. Viva Insights has a lot more topics, has a lot more than even are represented here as segments and other things are launched and realized within the marketplace. These are improvements within these products. So there's a lot of things that are constantly changing where you need to continually to have a new governance discussion. This shouldn't be a bad thing. It shouldn't feel like overwhelming, like, oh, we'll never catch up, so we shouldn't invest in the first place. What it means is that our governance approach that we need to use needs to be done, again, at foundational responsible enablement, and then it needs to be annualized or quarterly reviewed, et cetera. We need to have a review cycle and time, investment prepared, operationally forecasted to do those things. So governance is a strategic investment, needs to be done. And if we do it, again, it's an efficiency gainer. It delivers more value. It helps us maximize the broad swaths of technology we're investing in the first place. If your technology, purchase price is X, without governance, your, maximization of that is very limited. With good governance, you're going to be much better at maximizing and recouping the ROI of that investment. And this is why governance, and we'll talk about in a second, why governance and adoption are so intrinsically connected, at least in the way that I've presented it to you today, right? So proactive governance and adoption is also something that we can do better. Now, I've talked about governance a lot, and I've kind of hinted at ways to make governance more of a service, a running service. I want to talk about adoption for a moment, because this is one where we see a lot of times done the wrong way as well, where you have a project and you have a little adoption task within the project, which is really just training. We'll talk about training in a second. And so this is a problem because it means you're not really treating it like a service, and you're not really adapting your adoption to be proactive. You can't be proactive if you're doing everything project, because you're reacting to the outcomes of the success criteria of that project. All right, so that's directionally where we want to go. How do we get there? Well, one way to think about it is that successful adoption is driven from two areas of the business. Now, these are just like 6 examples of things that drive and help lead towards successful adoption. And successful adoption is what we want, right? Not just that people are using Microsoft Teams, but they're using it in the ways that enable them to be better performance-wise. And so governance, policies, and guidance, the things we've talked about before, on the left-hand side, those things all influence adoption. Absolutely they do, right? They reduce risks, they drive efficiency, they do all those things and more. Policies, things that aren't even listed here, there's many, many more would all fit in here. Responsible configuration and enablement, those would fit here as well. All of those things lead to greater adoption because if they're not configured the right way, often, again, some of the defaults are actually not that great for adoption, so we want to tweak them. On the right-hand side, you see something else, which is essentially how do we actually drive, how do we move adoption further? How do we help people realize the value of these things and then get more value out of them? And so this is where I think a lot of customers also make a big mistake, and just like the governance one. And so the end solution, what we want out of this is something like this. An adoption roadmap or campaign where you're doing a series of different activities. If you don't like the word campaign, call it an adoption plan, but note that an adoption plan is a point in time and we need to do many adoption plans over many years, et cetera, for this to be successful. So your adoption campaign should be things like, I don't like saying like Microsoft 365 or Microsoft Teams adoption campaign. That's not what you should do. It'd be like making meetings better. So meetings matter, making meetings better. That's a campaign. Everyone understands intuitively if you just describe the campaign. Everyone wants to be a part of it. Everyone has something that they want to share, tips, tricks, guidance, etc. And it just so happens that part of that campaign includes things like tips and tricks on how to better use why we should record meetings, how transcripts work, how to use Microsoft Teams more effectively in meetings, post meetings with app mentions and things like that, and follow-up tasks before meetings, how do you collaborate on a PowerPoint presentation before the meeting, etc. You can imagine we're just this concept of making meetings better, which is something that, again, you'll get no resistance. Everyone will want to have a campaign like that at an org level, department level, doesn't matter. And then we can actually structure, these technical things, these technical tips and things like that, along with, behavioral tips, like, with remote meetings, what's the right etiquette for before the meeting starts? Should we have that as like water cooler time where people can talk about whatever? Do we always start on time? Yes, right? Like, obviously I have strong preferences here, but there's things like that you can do. Why? Because it's recorded, and so there shouldn't be a problem if someone joins late, etc. So there's lots and lots of things to talk about here, but generally speaking, defining your adoption campaigns so they're like business-centric or outcome-driven is the goal, and we want to have them be patterning lots of activities together because that allows you to have more success. So let me frame it a different way. If you think about adoption, what most people do is they throw training at the problem. And training is an optimization activity, right? It's this level 2, it's guiding understanding. Training's great if you already have an interest in something because it helps you optimize and use that tool better, right? What's missing is interest and awareness that there is even a different way of doing that thing. And that's what most customers don't spend enough money and time and effort on. And that's the thing that drives the most value. So if you say to someone like, yes, of course we can have better meetings. Yes, of course, there's ways to improve training and execution around meetings. But the big one there is, did you know that there's other ways to offset collaboration or to prepare for meetings, to make meeting post-meeting experiences better? Those things are awareness and interest drivers, and they're a lot easier to do, they're lower cost, and they're things you should do more of than just the training. And when you do them along with training, right, together, that's when you get the real success you want, because now you get much greater attendance of that training, virtual or non-virtual, and you also get a lot more follow-up on people watching recordings and stuff of that training as well, or even a request for an additional training, depending on capacity restraints and other things like that. Now, all of these things together lead to a sense of value, right? And realizing value or maximizing value is sort of the third level, because once we have an understanding and we've had that interest and awareness, we still need to help people recognize the value it's providing. And one of the reasons that a lot of organizations struggle with adoption is because they don't acknowledge that, when you introduce a productivity change, productivity dips, right? Until they actually start using this tool in a more effective way, technically productivity dips before they get back up there. So you want to make this a safe space. Doing adoption campaigns, training, other activities, that's a safe space for productivity to dip. And by the end of that training or by the end of that interaction, they're hopefully at a point where now they're only up and up and up, better and better and better in terms of performance. So just some more indicators there. Now, I don't have time to talk all this. Again, it's in that resource. All the resources will be linked at the end as well. But if you were just to look at this in a simple way, you might have tips. And tips would be, again, interest drivers, awareness builders, things like that, as well as how-to tips. So if you think of tips in that mechanism, we can have lots of different people representing tips, right? You can have people across the business. So it doesn't need to be driven as a campaign just from like an executive committee or a small group. It can be lots of people's voices within the tips constraints, right? You could even give them tips. Say, here's a bunch of written tips for you. We're going to do this week's theme is around search or discovery. Here's a bunch of tips. Copy paste these or tweak them as you will, right? So you can even make it really easy for those who are contributing tips. Another example is contests, where contests don't have to have actual costs. You can actually do things like have, this is actually a really powerful one, a virtual lunch with an executive. Hugely valuable. Lots of people want time with executives. It's an easy win. So you could do something like that. We have lots of examples of contests in the Office 365 resources.com resource as well. So again, lots of ways to tackle things like tips, tricks, training. Again, training is important, but it needs to be supported by these other things. Another one that comes up a lot is, why do we even have these from a time sensitive perspective? Why is it like a 30-day activity, et cetera? Because that allows us to have a baseline measure and then a continual measure through it. And then of course, 3-6 months later, a measure post campaign or investment action. And this is very, very valuable and tends to show very quickly why more and more investment should be made in digital excellence and adoption. And so if you're looking for more insight there, again, more homework, you can look at the M365 metrics white paper, which breaks down many, many ROI calculations and how to do them and things like that. So if you're looking like for organizational guidance on ROI and things like that, besides the Forrester reports and things like that that you can get access to for Microsoft 365, again, just ping me if you need guidance on those. You can also use these types of resources as well. All of these things we're doing enrich like a center of excellence, right? You should have sort of a digital hub for digital excellence in your organization. And whether that points to now Viva Learning and now that points to your effective capital L LMS system is up to you, but you want to definitely have something that is the center, the gravity well, right? The end of that journey for a lot of people, because then that makes those campaigns and those activities and those things we've been mentioning, they have a place to live, they have a place to grow. And they, again, when one person comes in one campaign, now they can consume a whole lot of self-service material and guidance and reach out to mentors and learn more about governance, right? Your governance material should be here as well, et cetera, that they wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So this is another one of those ideas in that idea book. I hope this is helpful for you guys. So what am I saying? Let's take a step back. Today, what I'm really getting at is that adoption services is a series of different activities that are, it's a service, right? A series of activities that we're doing regularly, reviewing governance readiness, which is a part of adoption, aligning with business objectives, measuring and reviewing, planning and executing campaigns, and improving continually the digital center of excellence. You're doing all of these things continually, and that leads to successful adoption. And so governance is actually arguably a small piece of that adoption pie. And so with that, I really hope this has been helpful for you guys. Those resources, again, will be on the next slide as well, but they're all here. And so with that, I think we'll switch to Q&A or a demo with the Syskit team. And if you guys haven't seen it, it's a pretty awesome set of tools and capabilities. No way it can be done justice in a few minutes. So excited to see what's shown today. And then feel free to look up more information, just like I said before, and reach out.
Thank you, Richard. Can you, Damir, just confirm that you can hear me well?
Yep, I hear you and see your screen.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you for the great presentation, Richard. You really covered a lot of topics. And right now, I will just try to give you a really brief demo of Syskit Point. So let's begin with what Syskit Point was actually aimed for. So we see it as a central point for all your M365 governance and security, where you can see an overview of all the artifacts you have in your environment. You can then go ahead and filter in many different ways desired on what you want to tackle. And as Richard mentioned, you can also filter with some custom metadata you have filled out. So for example, if you're only interested in confidential workspaces, you can select them and then perform some actions, such as, for example, change sharing settings. But not to be completely manual, we also covered a lot of automatic workflows in Syskit Point. So let's just go ahead to our governance section in the settings. So as Richard mentioned, it is a continuous work, and we do have a lot of automations from the beginning to the end of the workspace lifecycle. But today I will focus briefly on what the beginning of a lifecycle looks like for us in Syskit. So you can see that we have multiple templates here available for provisioning of new workspaces, and we'll just quickly create a new one. So the first step that your administrator has to take is decide which workspace he would like to create a template for. In this case, let's go ahead and do a template for some external teams. I'll just briefly like to name and description here. And the first thing you need to decide is the privacy. What's quite important here that you as an administrator can either decide on the privacy yourself, or you can let your end users, the one that will be requesting the certain team, decide on this value. Moving on, you can decide on ownership, membership, and set up primary and secondary contact. That's another type of metadata we offer currently. So you can decide which person will act as a contact for new created resources. Then you define sharing settings and permissions, and then you can decide on these different metadata fields. For example, you can apply confidential sensitivity label from the beginning of these workspaces. You can decide which department they belong to, or let your end users do so. You can even add terms and conditions. So if you need to stay compliant, you can add certain links here for your terms and conditions that users need to meet before they can even submit a request for a new workspace. Then something that often also leads to clutter is the naming convention that Richard talked about. So you often have a lot of teams with the exact same names. So by enforcing a naming rule, you can actually make sure to differentiate those better. The approval process in Syskit can be multi-stage, so you can choose between 1 to 3 stage processes, and you can define all the people that will be approvers in each of these stages. And this is probably the most important part. You can actually enforce some governance policies and automations right from the beginning of the workspace's lifecycle. So these include access reviews. These are probably the most important because they offer you to continuously monitor the teams that were created using these templates. You can decide it to be weekly, monthly, whatever you prefer, and you can let your end users actually check who has access to what and which documents have been shared. Externally is what's most important, obviously, and then you can make sure that this team will actually be compliant and secure through the end of its life cycle. You can also define minimum number of owners and maximum as well, which is important not to lead to the orphaned resources, which we also can detect right from the beginning. And lastly, you can define the availability of this template. So you can choose for it to be seen to everyone or just to specific people in your company. And then you can define them to be, for example, from only a certain department. And if you choose so, then only the people from marketing department will be able to see these templates. So let's go ahead and see what it actually looks like to your end users. So we have created, just give me a sec. I think I'm showing, yeah, now you can see the right screen. So what we created is a Syskit Point Teams app where your end users can actually send requests for new teams. And this is what the interface looks like to them. They can see all the requests they already sent, and they can try to send a new one. For example, let's now stick on with Microsoft Teams. They will choose one of the templates. These templates are the one that you just seen have been created. They will have to input some data here, and then they will click request, and they can view what's the status of that request. So this one is awaiting response from this person, and they can actually see whether it has been approved or denied. All right, and let's just briefly go back to Syskit Point once again. So besides the provisioning that you just saw, in a sec, okay. We also offer lifecycle management, meaning that you can define that your inactive teams after a certain amount of days needs to be validated by their owners. So they can either choose to keep them, archive, or delete them at this point. And you can also set up the access reviews I talked about, so you can define them, everything regarding them here. Besides defining them, you also have the screen with a dashboard where you can actually see the overview of everything that's going on in your environment. But that is something that will be covered in the following topics, and you can see it in the demos in the following days. So that's pretty much where I will end my demo for today. And let's go back to you, Tony. Hopefully the sound is okay now.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I don't know what happened, but it's like the challenges of these virtual ones. something breaks down every now and then. So Richard, we have a couple of questions after your wonderful presentation. So I'm going to try to summarize what our viewers have been asking. So Mara wants to know, she comments that the directory is a very nice idea, but she is worried that her directory will go out of sync over time. So what kind of best practices you have to making sure that any change made in the actual system is reflected in the directory?
Yeah, so it doesn't need to be that difficult, actually. So what you have, let's say, let's just use the word registry instead of the UX layer for directory, in case you have that could be a web part. Like there's lots of ways directory could be represented, which is like a subset, right, of content that has the metadata that's been approved, like whatever, right? Because some customers even have like a process of to get promoted from the directory, you have to be in the registry, and then you have to have a review with like departmental owner saying, yes, that's good to go, and then it gets published, et cetera. So again, there's lots of flexibility in how you implement it. At the end of the day, though, one, if new creation spaces request is, let's say 80% of the spaces that are created are through that mechanism, then that helps with that maintenance, right? Because then that can be programmatically part of the same registry. Number two, you can actually really easily, just with some PowerShell or very lightweight scripting, you can essentially go and check what new spaces exist that aren't represented in the registry or directory. You just do it by URL, right? So what are the new spaces? What are the new teams? What are the new SharePoint sites? What are the new X spaces? And that's important because let's say you wanted to also represent all the Confluence spaces, or I'm trying to pick third-party products, but like maybe even SharePoint server spaces, right? You could arguably do that as well through different scripting and techniques, and you just kind of have these as imports that import them to this registry. These is important. The ones that are imported now just have essentially a flag that says it's not in the directory, it's just been imported from X, and you have some sort of hopefully Power Automate or other processes. Again, I'm assuming a lot of like SharePoint lists in the back end or Microsoft lists, where then you would manage that, right, from an IT perspective. So we'd say, oh, okay, what is this information? How do we get that, et cetera? And some of those automations can be really intuitive, where you just reach out to the stakeholder and then they fill out that information in a simple form, and then that form again populates the list. So there's ways that you can automate that ingestion of new content. We have customers, of course, that example I showed, we built those kinds of solutions in Azure, et cetera, that are sort of monitors that look for new teams, new SharePoint spaces, et cetera, new Yammer communities that get created, and then again, automatically add them to this backlog. Or you could do none of those things, and you could literally do a really manual process where you go to the SharePoint Admin Center, you click that little export icon under all the SharePoint site collections that you can see, you export them, and then you reconcile that manually with a list and a list. Like, you don't even need to be technical, arguably, to do what I'm describing. Even that scenario is better than not having an awareness of these spaces, or that how many spaces we don't have metadata or we don't have this information on. So that's really what I'm saying. It's okay if management is, there's a small percentage of spaces where we can't get the answers to, et cetera. They're truly, arguably unmanaged in any way except for the general rules that apply to all spaces. And at least we know what those ones are. And then you can have lots of conditions to make sure that those get archived, or that, various steps are taken to reduce the risk. They can't be externally accessed, whatever, right? There's lots of ways to potentially mitigate risk there. So, so I don't, it is a problem, but it's one that's very tangible, and there's multiple paths to resolving, whether it's some scripting, whether it's a custom service, or whether it's something like Syskit or something else that supplements gaps that are harder to solve in the out-of-the-box platform.
There is a follow-up question on that question, and that is, Jason wants to know, is there a good suggestion for having a directory of thousands, 20,000 teams and 12,000 SharePoint sites?
Yeah, so we've obviously, there are third-party vendors in the space that have massive customers. Ourselves, we have multiple customers that are over 100,000 seats who have, I don't even know how many, like I really wish I knew. I know one of them at least has over 500,000 sites and teams, because remember, each like private channel, each shared channel, those are also SharePoint site collections on the back end, right? So like number of sites is typically a bigger number, and what we see there is that in hundreds of thousands of patterns, it still works fine for directory, because one, the experiences that I'm describing, maybe not out of the box as much for list views, but I mean, technically it scales to hundreds of thousands. But even when we have like an SPFX controller or whatever, it's how you render it, right? So lazy loading or doing things like, pre-filtering or, all sorts of other things can help with that. Keep in mind too, one of the other reasons directory experiences as their own abstracted concept have value is because the way you bookmark things out of the box is you follow a site, you pin a team, there's multiple mechanisms, and I'm not even gonna get into like how do you do things in Confluence, how do you do things in Facebook, et cetera, right? So when you have multiple ways in which people bookmark them, you can still ingest those signals and apply, essentially those bookmarks for the user, kind of pre-build them for them, and then, sync those so that the user then themselves can also bookmark things through this directory. And so you can do lots of these kinds of experiences that improve the UX. Another very particular example that I'm a huge fan of is if you've ever been to the SharePoint home, there's this really great experience where they show frequent sites, recent sites, right? And bookmark sites. So in the frequent sites, those are popular and recent, and then the recent sites literally are like the last sites you visited. So that capability is just a graph call away. It's really easy to get that data. And so what you can do is you can take your directory experience, combine it with that kind of insight, and you can actually create things like show me my recent spaces. And again, you could even do this. There's actually graph data around this for Teams and other things like that that you could do yourself. Yammer has it. So you can actually do this where you see the recent spaces people have visited. Now, some of these, for recency, I want to be clear, I don't think you should solve long-term yourself, because in the Viva Connections experience, there's out of the box coming soon, where are things like my Yammer communities, my SharePoint sites. I think those are the only two public ones I can talk about, but there's like personal experiences like that that are built in. You should just use those, right? So we don't need to reinvent everything. If there's a good way of navigating out of the box with this or that, the problem is when you start to scale across multiple sites and spaces, that's where the directory comes in to be very valuable. And so again, pre-filtering the directory becomes really valuable. Most people, when they go to the true directory, they don't mind a little bit of a delay as it's loading. When you do a big filter and it's kind of hundreds of thousands of items, that's fine if it takes a few seconds. But when they're going to like, the R&D section of this large pharmaceutical, and they go to the R&D, from R&D to the directory, maybe it's pre-filtering to R&D, right? So things like that you can do that really reduce the loading time. Anyways, I'm getting way too technical, but there's no challenges with scaling these kinds of solutions, whether you build it yourself, whether you use a partner like Toolead, or whether you use a vendor solution like the various ways Syskit does it.
Okay, one interesting question from Jason as well is who should be involved in those workshops? Which job titles within the organization we should like kind of bring together to form the governance board or whatever you call it to make sure that the system is run in the best way?
Yeah, so I think this runs into two challenges, right? If you're a smaller organization, from an IT perspective, you need to have at least some champions who know essentially what the configuration options are, even if they don't configure them. So you can outsource and have a friend sit on a call and do these workshops with you, where you're just along for the ride and it's documented and recorded and everything else, and that's fine, in my opinion. Like, you don't have to do it with internal staff. Now, if you're larger, then I would encourage you to own that and then have external support maybe, but you still own it. And in that instance, you have like dedicated headcount focus within your IT group that this is, they manage Microsoft 365. And if you're going to manage Microsoft 365, you should do this responsible enablement, these other workshops, et cetera. And they'll organize and execute those workshops and invite different people, record them, make them as public as possible. Again, I really don't think for like key executive stakeholders, I feel like none of this should be secretive. Like, it should be public. And if they want to know why a decision was made, they can look at the recordings, or they can look at the notes, et cetera. But that's obviously a strong stance that can be different. Where it gets really complicated, both for the directory experience that I mentioned earlier and this, is when you have multiple organizations, multiple business units in one tenant, right? Or across multiple tenants, because now we have a technical challenge where there are ways to split up a tenant. There's ways to split up multiple tenants around organizational units and things like that with roles and responsibilities, but it makes governance a little bit more challenging potentially. So I do want to acknowledge that there are complications as you start to scale workshops and things like that. Even in those circumstances, for sure at the service level, there are certain configuration patterns that should be dictated at the service level teams. And then when those are communicated, if there's like, let me use a very specific example. Let's say you configure it so that you can't do external sharing. No guest linking, right, is one I see way too often overused. So they block guest linking, and now there's no path for users to have guest linking via OneDrive or via maybe like a dedicated extranet, SharePoint sites or even shared channels. Like if there's not a pathway for them, that's not proper governance, right? If you're saying I'm going to block this, but we don't have an option where there's a responsible or secure way for them to keep doing it, then this governance rule isn't really finished, right? Because what happens is when people do that, you end up getting people saying, well, I'm just going to use Dropbox or Box or these god-awful tools comparatively for security and compliance reasons to Microsoft, and I'm going to use those instead because I can do these things in those tools. And the reason that they can do those things in those tools is because your team just hasn't caught up, right? You just haven't caught up to the gaps that needs to be closed on those other tools. So I am 100% behind the idea that whenever you do this at a scaled level, when we do these workshops and other activities, you need to make sure that we're trying to find the best way to make sure there's always avenues and pathways, even if it's escalation and multiple approvals, that there's pathways for people to still enable these options. I really think if you don't do that, then you're doing yourself a disservice and you're just making a worse compliance and governance landscape. So yeah, hoping that helps. In terms of business, you can also have these meetings with IT or technical centric discussions and then present your findings and your decisions to the business and get their feedback on that. I definitely encourage that. I don't think the business should be involved in those very technical discussions, so you can scale that. The way that I often see organizations do that is they have sort of a tactical set of teams, like operations, dev teams, they have tactical teams, support, those are tactical teams. And then they'll have sort of a technical strategy team, and they'll have sort of a business strategy team. And the business strategy team is really the one after like the tactical teams come up with their ideas and their framing and things like that, that they get sort of feedback, approval, visibility on, et cetera. And the ability to say, I want a pathway, a secure and responsible pathway for me to do guest linking. It's a pattern of behavior I want to enable. How do we do that? Now it's the technical and tactical teams to figure out the pathway for that. So I'm hoping that helps. Unfortunately, the rest probably takes more time to explain.
Thank you, Richard. I think we should wrap it up here. We are going to distribute your presentation. So if somebody is looking to engage with Tutor2Lead for a governance project or anything related to Microsoft 365, you will find their contacts and you will be able to talk to Richard in more detail. You will also have a recording available, so we are going to send that out as soon as it's ready. Thank you, Richard, once again. The presentation was really magnificent, and I'm really looking forward to go through some of the details that you sent and some of the links that you posted. So thank you, everybody, for coming. Today we have a day 2. We are going to talk about compliance and Microsoft with Microsoft Teams in Microsoft Teams with Raphael. We start at the same time tomorrow. Thank you so much. Thank you, Richard, once again, and hope to see you soon at one of our future webinars.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.